Naomi Harris, a determined college student, never expected a quiet afternoon in the park to turn her life upside down. Falsely accused of theft by Officer Barnes, she's thrust into a battle far bigger than she imagined, facing racial profiling, public humiliation, and a fight for justice that quickly becomes a community-wide movement. With protests rising and her grandfather by her side, Naomi must decide how far she's willing to go to confront a system stacked against her. Will Naomi's voice spark the change her town so desperately needs? Dive into this gripping journey. Drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The afternoon sun bathed Clearwater in a soft, golden light as Naomi Harris stepped out of the towering glass building of Winters and Graves, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. At 19 years old, Naomi was more driven than most of her peers. She had worked tirelessly, juggling schoolwork, part-time jobs, and late-night study sessions, all with one goal in mind: becoming a lawyer. She wanted to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and today felt like a major step toward that goal. Naomi adjusted her crisp white blouse, her pulse still racing from the adrenaline of her interview. Her small handbag hung loosely from her arm as she made her way down the steps, every detail of the meeting replaying in her mind. She had prepared for weeks, studied every angle of the law firm, memorized her answers to possible questions, even practiced her handshake in front of the mirror. It had all been worth it. She was confident she had nailed it. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she pulled out her phone. She quickly typed a message to her grandfather, Henry Harris, the person who had inspired her to pursue this path. "Naomi, just finished. It went really well. I think I impressed them." A few moments later, her phone buzzed in her hand, Henry's response lighting up the screen. "Henry, knew you would. You're going to make them wish they hired you sooner. Want to celebrate when I pick you up?" Naomi grinned, feeling the familiar warmth of her grandfather's pride. Henry had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. He was the reason she had even considered law in the first place. Growing up, Naomi had heard countless stories of Henry's battles in court, fighting for civil rights and social justice. He had retired now, but the fire in him hadn't dimmed. "Naomi, absolutely. See you in about 30 minutes?" Henry, 30 it is. Can't wait to hear all about it. Naomi slipped her phone back into her bag and made her way toward the small park just a few blocks away. Clearwater was a small town, and the park had always been a favorite spot of hers, a place to relax and reflect. Today it felt like the perfect place to sit and savor the moment. As she strolled through the tree-lined paths, Naomi felt a sense of peace wash over her. The sounds of life filled the air. The distant chatter of families, children laughing as they played near the fountain, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mingled with the scent of flowers blooming from the market stalls, and for a moment, Naomi allowed herself to just breathe it all in. She found a bench near the fountain, the familiar trickle of water soothing her nerves. Pulling out her phone again, she glanced at the time. Henry would be there soon. 30 minutes to just sit, relax, and reflect on the possibilities. Maybe she would get the internship. Maybe this was the start of her career. The thought filled her with excitement. Naomi opened a law article she had bookmarked earlier, her mind eager to stay sharp. She was still running on adrenaline, and it felt good to channel it into something productive. The quiet buzz of the town around her was comforting, reminding her of how far she had come. She had grown up in Clearwater, a town that felt like home, even when it sometimes felt too small for her dreams. Her path had always been clear: study hard, push herself, and rise above the expectations placed on her. As the minutes ticked by, Naomi found herself daydreaming about the future. She imagined working at Winters and Graves, learning from some of the best attorneys in the state, making a real difference in people's lives. She could see herself standing in a courtroom, confident and commanding, just like her grandfather had done all those years ago. Everything seemed perfect, peaceful. But in Clearwater, peace was often fleeting. Meanwhile, Officer David Barnes was on his regular patrol, walking through the bustling market area of Clearwater. He had been with the police department for nearly 20 years, long enough to know every nook and cranny of the town. Clearwater was relatively quiet compared to bigger cities, but Barnes prided himself on being vigilant. His dedication to keeping the peace sometimes crossed into overcaution, but he didn't care. As far as he was concerned, his job was to protect the town, at any cost. Barnes wiped a bead of sweat from his brow as he scanned the crowds. The market was in full swing, vendors shouting about fresh produce, families moving from stall to stall. His hand rested on his belt, fingers grazing the cool surface of his radio. He felt it buzzed with static as a call came in. Unit 12, report of a petty theft at the market. The suspect is a young woman, possibly in dark clothes. No further description available. Barnes narrowed his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. A young woman in dark clothes. That wasn't much to go on, but it was enough. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him to be on the lookout. He continued his patrol, his steps deliberate as he surveyed the people around him. There were plenty of young women in the crowd, some chatting with friends, others haggling with vendors, but none of them stood out to him. No one seemed suspicious until his eyes landed on Naomi, sitting on a park bench near the fountain, her head down as she focused on her phone. Barnes slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. She was sitting alone away from the market. Her dark blouse and professional demeanor didn't immediately scream suspect, but something about her being there, disconnected from the market's hustle and bustle, caught his attention. She wasn't interacting with the vendors, wasn't carrying any bags. He made his way toward her, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. As he approached, he couldn't help but feel that familiar tug of suspicion. He had seen it before, people acting too calm, too composed. It always made him wary. Naomi, still engrossed in her phone, didn't notice him at first. She was reading an article on recent civil rights cases, feeling inspired by the progress being made in some parts of the country. She was so lost in thought that the shadow falling over her startled her. She looked up to find Officer Barnes towering over her. "Excuse me, miss," Barnes said, his voice sharp but controlled. Naomi blinked, confused by the sudden intrusion. "Yes, officer. Is something wrong?" Barnes crossed his arms, his gaze sweeping over her. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Naomi frowned, her confusion deepening. "I'm just waiting for my ride. My grandfather is picking me up." Barnes nodded, but his expression remained stern. "We've had a report of a theft in this area. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The question hit Naomi like a cold splash of water. "A theft?" Her heart skipped a beat. "A theft?" she repeated, her voice uncertain. "No, I don't know anything about that. I've just been sitting here." Barnes's eyes remained fixed on her. "You fit the description. A young woman, sitting alone near the market." Naomi's stomach twisted. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. "But I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "I've been here the whole time, waiting for my grandfather." Barnes shifted his stance, his suspicion deepening. "Let me see your bag," he demanded, his tone no longer a question, but an order. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as a wave of anxiety washed over her. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the strap of her small handbag. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I told you, I haven't stolen anything." "If you have nothing to hide, then let me check," Barnes replied coldly, his hand already reaching out. Naomi hesitated, the fear rising inside her. She could feel the eyes of the people around her. the curious glances from passers-by as they began to take notice of the scene unfolding before them. Her peaceful afternoon had been shattered, and now she was standing on the edge of something she didn't understand. The sounds of the bustling market seemed to fade as Naomi handed over her handbag, her fingers trembling as she let go of the strap. She had packed it so carefully that morning, her wallet, her phone, a few notes from her interview. Everything was in perfect order, nothing out of place, and yet as Barnes took the bag from her hands, she felt exposed, vulnerable, in a way she had never felt before. Barnes unzipped the bag swiftly, practiced motions, pulling out each item with the same mechanical detachment he used when handling evidence. Naomi's wallet, her phone, and a small notebook, all innocent items, but under Barnes's scrutiny, they felt like potential weapons. Naomi stood frozen, her heart racing as she watched him go through her things. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just a law student waiting for her ride in a park. How had it come to this? Barnes glanced up at her, his eyes still filled with suspicion. "What are you doing here again?" "I'm waiting for my grandfather," Naomi repeated, her voice firmer now. "I told you, I haven't done anything wrong." But Barnes wasn't convinced. He closed her handbag and handed it back to her, but the gesture felt more like a dismissal than an apology. "You fit the description," he said flatly. "A young woman alone in the park." Naomi's heart sank. The description was so vague, it could have been anyone. But somehow she was the one standing here, being questioned, being judged. She could feel the weight of the stares from the people passing by, the silent accusations in their eyes. Barnes crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station for further questioning." Naomi's stomach dropped. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice rising in disbelief. Barnes's face remained impassive. "You fit the description, and until we clear this up, I need you to come with me." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. Naomi felt a wave of panic wash over her. This couldn't be happening. She hadn't stolen anything. She had been sitting in the park minding her own business, but now everything was spiraling out of control, and she didn't know how to stop it. Desperation clawed at her chest. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed her grandfather's number with trembling fingers, praying he would answer. "Grandpa," she whispered when he picked up, "a police officer is accusing me of stealing. I don't know what to do." Henry's voice was calm, steady like it always was in moments of crisis. "I'm on my way, Naomi. Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." Naomi hung up the phone, her hands still shaking as she looked up at Officer Barnes. "My grandfather is coming," she said, her voice wavering. "He's a lawyer. He'll help clear this up." But Barnes didn't seem to care. His eyes remained cold and his posture stiff. "We'll see." Naomi could feel the tears threatening to spill over, but she fought to keep them at bay. She couldn't cry here, not in front of these people. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Naomi stood frozen in place, her heart racing as the seconds ticked by. The peaceful square that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. People were watching her, some curious, others judgmental, and a few whispering amongst themselves. She could feel their eyes on her as if they were waiting for her to slip up to reveal some hidden guilt. But she wasn't guilty. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had always followed the rules, always done what was expected of her. And yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. Naomi glanced down at her phone again, checking the time. Her grandfather would be here soon. She just had to hold on until then. Barnes stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with a mix of suspicion and indifference. He didn't seem to care about her protests, about the fact that she had done nothing wrong. All that seemed to matter to him was that she fit the description, vague as it was. Naomi's thoughts raced. How had things escalated so quickly? Just an hour ago, she had been sitting in her interview, feeling hopeful about her future. Now her entire world felt like it was collapsing around her. She had heard stories like this before, stories of people being targeted, profiled, because of the color of their skin. But she had never imagined it would happen to her. She had always believed that if you worked hard, if you followed the rules, the world would treat you fairly. But now, standing in the middle of this crowd, under the suspicious gaze of a police officer, that belief was starting to crack. The sound of footsteps behind her pulled her from her thoughts. Naomi turned to see her grandfather, Henry, approaching with long, determined strides. His face was calm, but she could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had fueled him through decades of fighting for justice. "Naomi," he said, his voice steady as he reached her side. "Are you okay?" Naomi nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. "I didn't do anything, Grandpa," she whispered. "I was just sitting here and he thinks I stole something." Henry placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his gaze never leaving Barnes. "I know, sweetheart. Don't worry. I'll handle this." Turning to face Barnes, Henry's calm demeanor belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Officer, I'm Henry Harris, Naomi's grandfather. Can you explain to me what's going on here?" Barnes straightened, his expression hardening as he recognized the shift in power dynamics. "We've had a report of a theft, and your granddaughter fits the description of the suspect," he said. "I need her to come down to the station for questioning." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fits the description? A vague description of a young woman sitting alone in a park? Is that really enough to detain her?" Barnes's jaw tightened. "It's protocol," he said, though the words felt weaker now. Henry took a slow, measured breath, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority. "Officer, you've searched my granddaughter's belongings. You found nothing. And now you're asking her to come to the station based on a vague description that could fit any number of people. I don't think that's reasonable suspicion." The tension between the two men was palpable, and Naomi could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Barnes, for the first time, looked uncertain. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around at the growing crowd, their eyes fixed on him. "We're just following up on the report," Barnes said, his voice tight. Henry's gaze didn't waver. "You've done your follow-up. Now I'm asking you to let my granddaughter go, or we'll be filing a formal complaint with the department. And trust me, I know how to navigate the legal system." Barnes hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. The crowd was watching, and the longer he stood there, the more it became clear that he had no real grounds to continue detaining Naomi. But backing down would mean admitting he was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, Barnes finally stepped back, his posture stiff. "You're free to go," he said, though the words were laced with frustration. Naomi felt a rush of relief, her body sagging slightly as the tension began to ease. She hadn't realized just how tightly she had been holding herself. Henry gave Barnes a curt nod. "Good decision, officer." Without another word, Henry turned to Naomi, placing a comforting hand on her back as he guided her away from the square and toward his car. The murmurs of the crowd followed them, a low hum of disbelief, curiosity, and judgment. But Naomi didn't care. She just wanted to get away from there. As they walked, Naomi's thoughts swirled in a mix of anger, confusion, and relief. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been made to feel like she had. The injustice of it all burned inside her, but for now, she was just grateful that her grandfather had been there to stand up for her. But even as they reached the car, Naomi knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The car ride from the park was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that was almost too loud. Naomi stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and anger. She hadn't spoken much since her grandfather had pulled her away from Officer Barnes. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in slowly, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. Henry kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but Naomi could sense the tension in his posture. He was quiet, but she knew he was thinking deeply about everything that had transpired. Henry had fought his fair share of battles in his life. He had seen injustice, and he had taken it on head first. But now, seeing his granddaughter go through the same things he had fought to prevent, there was a different kind of fire in him. They pulled into the driveway of Henry's house, the familiar sight of the modest single-story home giving Naomi a sense of security. The house was old, with a well-kept garden and a porch that always felt like a sanctuary from the world. She had spent so many afternoons here as a child, playing in the yard, while Henry told her stories of the cases he'd worked on and the lives he'd tried to change. Naomi's legs felt weak as she stepped out of the car, the adrenaline from the confrontation starting to wear off. Her heart was still pounding, but now it was a dull throb, echoing in her chest. She followed Henry up the porch steps and into the house, where the familiar scent of lavender greeted her. Once inside, Henry turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Come sit," he said gently, motioning to the couch in the living room. Naomi sat down, her body sinking into the cushions as though she could finally let go of the tension that had been holding her upright. She looked at her grandfather, unsure of how to even begin processing what had just happened. "Grandpa, Her voice faltered. She didn't even know what she wanted to say. Henry sat down across from her, his brow furrowed with concern. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready, Naomi. But I want you to know that what happened today was wrong. You didn't deserve to be treated that way." Naomi nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "I just don't understand," she said quietly. "I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't bothering anyone. Why did he treat me like that?" Henry's face tightened, the anger he had held back in front of Barnes now flickering in his eyes. Because some people see the world through a lens of suspicion, and that lens is often pointed at people who look like us. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it's real, and that's why we fight. Naomi swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She had always known that her grandfather had fought against racism and injustice, but this was the first time she truly understood what that fight meant. It wasn't something distant, something from the history books. It was happening to her, right now. "I've heard about this happening to other people," Naomi said, her voice shaking slightly. "But I never thought it would happen to me. I thought if I worked hard, if I stayed out of trouble, I wouldn't have to deal with this." Henry's expression softened and he reached out, placing his hand on hers. "I know, sweetheart. And that's the hardest part. You've done everything right. You've followed the rules. But the problem isn't with you. It's with the system and the people who use it to justify their own biases." Naomi wiped her eyes, trying to keep the tears at bay. "What do we do now?" Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "We fight back. We hold them accountable. We make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug." Naomi looked at him, a mix of admiration and exhaustion in her eyes. "How? How do we fight back?" Henry gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll file a formal complaint. We'll make sure the police department knows that what happened to you was wrong, and if we have to, we'll take legal action." The idea of filing a complaint, of standing up to the police, made Naomi's stomach twist with anxiety. She had never been in a position like this before. The idea of going up against an entire system felt overwhelming, impossible even. But when she looked at her grandfather, his calm, steady resolve, she felt a flicker of strength. She wasn't in this alone. "Do you think they'll take it seriously?" Naomi asked, her voice small. Henry's eyes darkened slightly. "They'll have to. I've been in this game a long time, Naomi. I know how to make them listen." Naomi nodded slowly, feeling a sense of relief. If anyone could navigate this, it was her grandfather. He had fought bigger battles than this, and he had come out the other side stronger. But even with Henry by her side, Naomi couldn't shake the fear that had settled in her chest. "What if they don't listen?" Naomi asked softly. Henry's gaze was steady. "Then we make them listen." Naomi tossed and turned that night, sleep evading her as her mind replayed the events of the day over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Officer Barnes towering over her, his cold expression as he demanded to search her bag. She could feel the stares of the people around her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. It was suffocating. At some point in the early morning, Naomi finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to wake up a few hours later with the same knot of anxiety in her chest. She sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes as the sunlight streamed through the curtains. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was still racing. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, scrolling through the news feed without really seeing the words on the screen. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the park, to the way Barnes had looked at her, like she was guilty before she had even said a word. The memory stung, a constant reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, there were still people who would look at her and see only one thing: her skin color. Naomi's phone buzzed with a message from Julia, her best friend. "Julia, hey, are you okay? I heard what happened at the park yesterday. I'm so sorry. Do you want to talk?" Naomi sighed, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about it, even with Julia, but she also knew that keeping everything bottled up inside wasn't helping. "Naomi, I don't know, I'm still trying to figure out what to think. I'm just tired." A few moments later, Julia replied, "Julia, that's totally understandable. I just want you to know I'm here for you, whenever you're ready." Naomi smiled softly, grateful for Julia's support. They had been friends since high school, and Julia had always been the one person Naomi could rely on to be there, no matter what. But even with her friends and her grandfather by her side, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a battle she wasn't prepared for. She needed to do something. She couldn't just sit here and let the fear consume her. After a quick shower and breakfast, Naomi sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. She had decided to start researching how to file a formal complaint against the police department. Henry had offered to take care of it, but Naomi wanted to be involved. She needed to understand the process, to take back some control over the situation. As she typed "how to file a complaint against a police officer" into the search bar, her mind flashed back to the look on Officer Barnes's face. The coldness, the indifference. It made her blood boil just thinking about it. How could he have looked at her and immediately assumed she was guilty? How many other people had been treated the same way? How many had just accepted it and moved on because they felt like they didn't have any other choice? Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a local news outlet. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the link, her stomach twisting as she read the headline, "Clearwater Police Department faces racial profiling allegations after incident in Town Square." Her eyes scanned the article, taking in the details. Apparently, several witnesses had come forward, describing the scene between Naomi and Officer Barnes. Some had even recorded videos of the confrontation, which had quickly spread on social media. The article mentioned that the police department was conducting an internal investigation, but there were no guarantees of what the outcome would be. Naomi's chest tightened as she scrolled through the comments section. Some people were outraged on her behalf, calling for accountability and justice, but others were less kind. She was probably acting suspicious. Cops don't just stop people for no reason. Playing the race card as usual. If she didn't do anything wrong, why didn't she just cooperate? Naomi's hands clenched into fists, her stomach churning with anger and hurt. How could people be so cruel? They didn't even know her, and yet they were so quick to judge, so quick to assume that she must have done something wrong. She slammed the laptop shut, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her chest. Naomi? Her grandfather's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts. She looked up to see Henry standing in the doorway, his face lined with concern. "You okay?" he asked, stepping into the room. Naomi shook her head, unable to find the words to describe the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "People are saying awful things about me online," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even do anything wrong, and they're acting like I'm guilty." Henry sighed, sitting down across from her at the table. "Unfortunately, that's how it goes sometimes," he said gently. "People are quick to judge, especially when they don't have all the facts." Naomi looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to deal with this." Henry reached across the table, placing his hand on hers. "You're stronger than you think, Naomi. This isn't easy, but you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here, your friends are here, and there are people out there who are fighting for you." Naomi nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What do we do next?" Henry gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We keep fighting. We file the complaint, and we make sure they know we won't let this go." Naomi took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of determination. She wasn't going to let this define her. She wasn't going to let them win. The following week was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal discussions as Naomi and Henry prepared to file the formal complaint against Officer Barnes. Henry, with his decades of legal experience, had taken the lead, but Naomi was determined to be involved in every step of the process. She wasn't going to be a passive bystander in her own fight for justice. They sat together in Henry's office, the desk cluttered with papers and legal documents. The room smelled faintly of old books, and the soft hum of the air conditioner provided a background noise as Henry reviewed the final draft of the complaint. Naomi leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees as she watched her grandfather work. She had always admired the way he carried himself, calm, composed, and full of quiet authority. He had been fighting these battles his whole life, and now she was following in his footsteps. "Okay," Henry said, setting down the pen. "I think we're ready to submit this." Naomi nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. This was it, the first official step in holding Barnes accountable. "Are you sure they'll take it seriously?" Naomi asked, her voice filled with doubt. Henry met her gaze, his eyes steady. "They'll have to. We've done everything by the book. If they try to sweep this under the rug, we'll take it to the next level." Naomi swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The idea of going up against the police department was terrifying, but she knew it was the right thing to do. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. As they left Henry's office and headed to the courthouse to submit the complaint, Naomi felt a sense of empowerment slowly growing inside her. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she had some control over the situation. She wasn't just reacting, she was taking action. When they arrived at the courthouse, Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the clerk's office. The air felt heavy with anticipation, and her palms were slick with sweat. Henry handed the paperwork to the clerk, and Naomi stood by his side, her nerves buzzing as she watched the clerk stamp the documents. And just like that, it was done. They walked out of the courthouse together, the sun shining brightly overhead. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the warm air fill her lungs. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a step in the right direction. As they walked toward the car, Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her eyes widened as she saw the notification. A new article had just been published about the case, and this time it wasn't just a local story. Naomi quickly opened the article, her breath catching in her throat as she read the headline, "National Spotlight on Clearwater Police as Racial Profiling Case Gains Attention." The article detailed the growing public interest in the case, highlighting the viral videos of Naomi's confrontation with Barnes and the widespread calls for police reform. The story was spreading, and it wasn't just confined to Clearwater anymore. Naomi looked up at her grandfather, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's going national," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's expression was unreadable as he took the phone from her and skimmed the article. After a moment, he handed it back to her with a small nod. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "Things are going to get a lot bigger from here." Naomi's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about filing a complaint anymore. It was about something much larger, a movement that was growing beyond anything she had anticipated. And she was at the center of it. A week after submitting the complaint, Naomi and Henry were called into a meeting with Mayor Michael Thompson, the mayor of Clearwater. The meeting had been arranged after growing public pressure forced the town's leadership to respond to the escalating situation. Naomi's nerves were on edge as they walked into the mayor's office, a large, imposing room with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the late afternoon light. Mayor Thompson was seated behind his desk, his expression tense as he gestured for them to sit down. Henry gave Naomi a reassuring nod as they took their seats. He had dealt with politicians like Thompson before, men who were more concerned with optics than actual justice. Naomi had always known the mayor as a distant figure, someone who made speeches and appeared at public events. But now she saw the strain in his face, the pressure he was under to address the growing unrest in Clearwater. "Thank you for coming in," Thompson said, his voice formal. "I want to start by saying that we take these allegations very seriously, and we've launched an internal investigation into Officer Barnes's conduct." Naomi's jaw clenched slightly. An internal investigation wasn't what she wanted to hear. It sounded like another way of saying they would handle it behind closed doors and hope the public would forget. "We appreciate that, Mayor," Henry said, his tone polite but firm. "But an internal investigation isn't enough. My granddaughter was publicly humiliated, racially profiled, and treated as guilty without any cause. The people of this town are demanding accountability, and they won't accept a cover-up." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together on the desk. "I understand the frustration, Mr. Harris, and I assure you we're doing everything we can to ensure a fair and thorough investigation. But these things take time." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "Time isn't the issue here, Mayor. It's transparency. The public has seen the videos. They know what happened, and they're not going to be satisfied with a vague promise of investigation. They want action." Naomi watched the exchange, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen her grandfather like this before, so sharp, so focused. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a confrontation, and Henry wasn't backing down. Thompson sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Look, the police department is facing significant scrutiny right now. We've received multiple complaints from other citizens who have experienced similar treatment. This isn't just about your granddaughter anymore. It's about a larger issue that we're trying to address." Naomi felt a surge of anger at his words. "Trying to address?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're only addressing it because you're being forced to. If it weren't for the videos, for the protests, would you even be sitting here having this conversation with us?" Thompson glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "I understand how you feel, Miss Harris. But you have to understand that change doesn't happen overnight." Henry cut in, his voice low but full of authority. "Change doesn't happen if the people in power aren't willing to make it happen, Mayor. And right now, the people of Clearwater are watching. They're waiting for you to take responsibility for what's happening in this town." Thompson's gaze flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment Naomi thought she saw something like guilt in his eyes. But then he straightened his posture, his politician's mask slipping back into place. "We're committed to doing what's right," Thompson said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But we have to follow procedure." Naomi felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest. Procedure. Protocol. These words had been used as shields ever since the incident, as if they could excuse the injustice she had experienced. She wanted to scream, to tell the mayor that his words meant nothing without action. But she knew that wasn't how change happened. It was slow, painstaking, and often frustrating. Henry stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "We'll be watching closely, Mayor. And if we don't see the kind of action this situation demands, we'll take this to the courts." The threat hung in the air like a cloud, heavy with unspoken consequences. Thompson nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable. Understood. As they left the office, Naomi's mind buzzed with a mix of emotions, frustration, anger, and a small flicker of hope. The fight was far from over, but they had made their position clear. They weren't going to back down. Henry placed a comforting hand on her shoulder as they walked out into the evening air. "You did good in there," he said quietly. "You spoke up. That's what matters." Naomi nodded, though her stomach was still in knots. "I just don't know if it's enough," she admitted. Henry gave her a small smile. "It's never enough all at once, but every step we take brings us closer, and we've taken some big steps today." Naomi looked up at the sky, the last rays of the setting sun casting a golden glow over the town. It wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like she had the strength to keep fighting. Naomi sat on the porch of her grandfather's house, her knees pulled to her chest as she stared out at the garden. The world seemed so quiet compared to the chaos that had been swirling around her in the days since the meeting with Mayor Thompson. She hadn't realized how draining it would be, not just the legal battle, but the emotional toll that came with being thrust into the public eye. Everywhere she turned, it seemed like people were talking about her. Strangers on the street, classmates at school, people she barely knew. They all had an opinion about what had happened in the park that day. And it wasn't just the people in Clearwater. The videos of the confrontation with Officer Barnes had gone viral, and Naomi's face had become a symbol of the larger movement against police misconduct and racial profiling. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be Naomi. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, another notification lighting up the screen. She had stopped checking them after the first few days, the flood of messages and comments too overwhelming to deal with. Some were supportive, messages from people across the country telling her to stay strong, to keep fighting. But there were others, hateful, venomous comments accusing her of making a big deal out of nothing, of playing the victim. The worst ones accused her of lying, of trying to ruin a good police officer's life. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered at the edge of her mind, gnawing at her peace. She had never been one to seek attention, and now it seemed like the entire world was watching her every move, judging her for something she hadn't even done. The sound of footsteps on the porch pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Julia, her best friend, approaching with a soft smile. Julia had been her rock through all of this, always knowing when to give her space and when to pull her out of her own head. Today she had brought coffee, 2 steaming cups in hand, and Naomi felt a small spark of gratitude for the simple gesture. "Thought you might need this," Julia said, handing one of the cups to Naomi as she sat down beside her. Naomi took the cup, the warmth of it grounding her in the moment. "Thanks," she murmured. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the quiet between them comfortable. Julia had always been the kind of friend who didn't need to fill the silence with words, and Naomi appreciated that more than ever now. Sometimes the constant noise, whether it was the media, the public, or her own thoughts, was too much. She needed the stillness. After a while, Julia broke the silence. "How are you holding up?" Naomi sighed, resting her chin on her knees. "I don't know. I'm just tired. I didn't think it would be this hard." Julia nodded, her expression understanding. "It's a lot to deal with, but you're handling it better than most people would. You're stronger than you think, Naomi." Naomi shook her head. "I don't feel strong. I feel unscared. What if they don't take the complaint seriously? What if nothing changes? And even if something does change, what if people keep seeing me as this? I don't want to be defined by what happened." Julia reached over, placing a comforting hand on Naomi's arm. "You're not just a symbol, Naomi. You're a person. And the people who matter know that. Your friends, your family. We see you for who you are, not just what happened to you." Naomi swallowed hard, trying to blink back the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's just so hard. Everywhere I go, people are looking at me like I'm some kind of spectacle, and the things people are saying online." She trailed off, her voice shaking. Julia's grip tightened on Naomi's arm. "You need to stop reading those comments," she said firmly. "People online are cruel, and half of them don't even know what they're talking about. They don't know you." Naomi nodded, though the words didn't fully ease the ache in her chest. She knew Julia was right, but it didn't make the hurt any less real. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle whatever life threw at her. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about a system that was broken, about people's deep-seated biases and the way they saw the world. And now, she was the face of a movement she hadn't asked to lead. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Naomi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep fighting." Julia turned to her, her gaze steady. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "You've got your grandfather, you've got me, and you've got a whole community behind you. We're in this together." Naomi looked down at the cup of coffee in her hands, the steam rising in soft curls. She knew Julia was right. She wasn't alone. But the weight of it all still felt overwhelming, like she was carrying the hopes and expectations of so many people on her shoulders. "I just want to feel normal again," Naomi said quietly. Julia gave her a sad smile. "You will. But right now, things are going to be tough, and that's okay. It's okay to be scared, to feel overwhelmed. But just remember, you're not doing this for nothing. What you're fighting for matters. It matters to a lot of people." Naomi nodded, the tears finally spilling over as she let herself cry. Julia didn't say anything, just sat beside her, her presence a quiet comfort. The following days passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork as Naomi and her grandfather prepared to take their next steps. Filing the formal complaint against Officer Barnes was just the beginning, and Henry was determined to see it through to the end. He had made it clear to Naomi that this was about more than just one incident. This was about holding the entire system accountable for allowing officers like Barnes to act with impunity. Naomi sat in Henry's home office, the sound of rustling papers filling the air as her grandfather sifted through documents. The office was lined with bookshelves, every inch of space filled with legal texts and case files from Henry's long career as a civil rights lawyer. Naomi had spent countless hours in this room as a child, listening to her grandfather talk about justice, about the fight for equality. Now, she was part of that fight. "We're going to need to gather more evidence," Henry said, his voice calm but focused. "We have the videos from the park, and we have your statement. But if this is going to stick, we'll need to build a solid case." Naomi nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought of having to relive the experience again and again. She had already given her statement to the internal investigators, and the idea of having to testify in court was daunting, but she knew it was necessary. If they didn't fight this, it would just get swept under the rug like so many other cases before hers. "I'll do whatever it takes," Naomi said, her voice steady, despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Henry smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "That's the spirit," he said. "But I want you to remember that this isn't all on your shoulders. You're not alone in this, Naomi. We're going to fight this together." Naomi nodded, grateful for her grandfather's steady presence. He had always been her rock, and now more than ever, she needed his guidance. As they continued to prepare the case, Naomi couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping in. She knew that going up against the police department was going to be an uphill battle. The system was designed to protect officers like Barnes, to shield them from accountability. But she also knew that her grandfather had fought battles like this before, and he had won. "We should reach out to some of the witnesses," Henry said, flipping through a stack of papers. "There were a lot of people in the park that day. Some of them might be willing to give statements." Naomi's heart raced at the thought. It had been hard enough giving her own statement, reliving the humiliation, the fear, but asking others to get involved felt like an added burden. What if no one wanted to help? What if they were too scared? "I'll help," a voice came from the doorway. Naomi and Henry both turned to see Rebecca Evans, Officer Barnes's partner, standing in the doorway. Naomi hadn't seen her since the day in the park, but there had been whispers about Evans in the days following the incident. Some people said she had been uncomfortable with how Barnes had handled the situation, that she had tried to intervene but hadn't known how. Naomi's stomach twisted at the sight of her. She wasn't sure how to feel about Evans, whether she saw her as an ally or part of the problem. "You'll help?" Henry asked, his voice neutral as he assessed the officer. Evans nodded, stepping into the room, her hands clenched at her sides. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I should have done more. I should have said something. But I didn't, and I'm sorry." Naomi's throat tightened as she listened. The apology felt genuine, but part of her was still wary. Evans had been there that day. She had stood by while Barnes humiliated Naomi, and she hadn't said a word. But now, standing in front of her, Naomi could see the guilt in her eyes. "I want to make it right," Evans continued, her gaze meeting Naomi's. "I'll testify if that's what you need. I'll tell the truth about what happened that day, about how Barnes acted." Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "That would be a significant step," he said. "But you realize the risks involved in coming forward against your partner." Evans nodded, her jaw tight. "I know, but it's the right thing to do." Naomi remained silent, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to accept Evans's help, to believe that she was sincere. But another part of her, perhaps the part that still felt the sting of that day in the park, was hesitant to trust her. Henry seemed to sense Naomi's hesitation. "Naomi?" he asked gently, giving her the chance to speak. Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes locking with Evans, "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Why didn't you do something when it was happening?" Evan's expression faltered for a moment, but she didn't look away. "I was scared," she admitted. "I was scared of what it would mean for me, for my career. But that doesn't excuse what I did, or what I didn't do. And I want to make up for that if you'll let me." Naomi studied her for a long moment, weighing her options. She knew how important Evans's testimony could be for the case. Having someone from inside the department speak out against Barnes would be a game changer, but it didn't erase what had happened. "I'll let you testify," Naomi said finally, her voice firm, "but I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me, and for everyone else who's been treated like this." Evans nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The weeks following the filing of the formal complaint were a whirlwind. Naomi's case had become a rallying point for people in Clearwater and beyond. What had started as a single incident in the park had grown into a larger movement, with people from all walks of life coming together to demand justice, not just for Naomi, but for every person who had been wronged by a broken system. Protests erupted in Clearwater's town square, drawing crowds larger than anyone had anticipated. The square, usually a place of quiet commerce and community gatherings, had been transformed into a center of resistance. Banners and signs lined the streets, each one calling for an end to racial profiling and police misconduct. Naomi stood at the edge of the protest, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and fear. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't asked for it. But now, seeing the sea of people standing in solidarity, she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger than her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out to see a text from Julia. "Julia, I'm here, near the fountain. Come find me." Naomi smiled, scanning the crowd for her friend. It didn't take long to spot Julia, who was holding a sign that read, "Justice for Naomi, justice for all." Naomi weaved her way through the crowd, feeling the energy of the protest buzzing around her. There was something electric in the air, a sense of purpose that seemed to pulse through every person in the square. This wasn't just a protest, it was a movement. When Naomi reached Julia, they hugged tightly, the weight of everything they had been through finally easing a little in the warmth of their friendship. "You okay?" Julia asked, her voice filled with concern as she pulled back to look at Naomi. Naomi nodded, though her emotions were still swirling inside her. "Yeah, it's just a lot. I didn't expect all of this." Julia smiled softly. "That's because you're making a difference, Naomi. People are listening. They're paying attention." Naomi looked around at the crowd, her heart swelling with pride and humility. She had never imagined herself as a leader, but now, standing in the middle of this protest, she realized that she had become one. Whether she wanted it or not, people were looking to her for strength, for guidance. "Come on," Julia said, tugging her toward the front of the crowd. "They're about to start the speeches." Naomi followed her, her nerves bubbling as they approached the makeshift stage that had been set up in the square. A microphone stood at the center, and several speakers were already lined up to address the crowd. The first speaker was a local activist who had been instrumental in organizing the protest. He spoke passionately about the need for systemic change, his voice echoing through the square as the crowd cheered in agreement. As he spoke, Naomi felt her heart pounding in her chest. This was real. This was happening. When the activist finished, he turned to Naomi, motioning for her to step forward. The crowd quieted as Naomi took the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't prepared a speech. She hadn't expected to speak at all, but now, with all eyes on her, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying herself before she began. "I didn't ask to be here," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. I didn't ask to be the face of this movement. I didn't ask for what happened to me in the park that day, but here we are." The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on her. What happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't just one bad cop having a bad day. It's part of a system that's been broken for a long time. A system that treats people like me as guilty until proven innocent. A system that judges us not by our actions, but by the color of our skin. Naomi's voice grew stronger, the emotions she had been holding back spilling out. "But we're not going to stand for it anymore. We're not going to let them keep getting away with it. We're here today because we believe in justice. Not just for me, but for every person who has been wronged by this system." The crowd erupted into cheers, the noise overwhelming but empowering. "We can't change what happened," Naomi continued, her voice steady now, "but we can change what happens next. We can make sure that no one else has to go through what we went through. We can demand accountability. We can demand justice." The crowd's cheers grew louder, a powerful wave of support that washed over Naomi. She felt a surge of strength, a determination that burned brighter than the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since the incident in the park. "We're not just fighting for me," Naomi said, her voice rising above the cheers. "We're fighting for all of us, and we're not going to stop until we win." As the crowd erupted into applause, Naomi stepped back from the microphone, her heart racing. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. The protests continued to grow in the weeks that followed, each one drawing more attention from the media and putting more pressure on the Clearwater Police Department. The department's internal investigation into Officer Barnes had stalled, and the public was growing restless. People wanted answers, they wanted justice, and they weren't going to wait much longer. Naomi and Henry continued to work on building their case, gathering evidence and witness statements from the park that day. Officer Evans' decision to testify had given them a significant advantage, but Naomi knew it wasn't enough. The system was designed to protect officers like Barnes, and she feared that no matter how much evidence they gathered, it still might not be enough to hold him accountable. The media attention had only intensified, with national news outlets picking up the story and shining a spotlight on Clearwater. Naomi's face had become a symbol of the larger movement for police reform, and while the attention was overwhelming, it also felt empowering. People were listening. People cared. But with the support came the backlash. The same online trolls who had attacked Naomi after the initial incident had only grown louder as the protests gained momentum. They accused her of trying to destroy a good officer's career, of playing the race card to get attention. Some even claimed that the entire incident had been staged, that Naomi had orchestrated it to push a political agenda. The hate was exhausting, and there were days when Naomi wanted to shut it all out, to disappear from the spotlight and return to her normal life. But every time she felt like giving up, she thought about the people who had been standing with her, the people who had been fighting this fight long before her. She thought about her grandfather, who had spent his life fighting for justice, and the countless others who had been silenced by a system that refused to listen. Naomi knew she couldn't back down. Not now. One afternoon, Naomi and Henry were called into a meeting with the town's police chief, Chief Raymond Donovan. The meeting had been requested after the protests outside the police station had grown too large to ignore, and Naomi could feel the tension in the air as they entered the station. Chief Donovan was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He sat behind a large wooden desk, his fingers steepled as he watched Naomi and Henry enter the room. Beside him sat Officer Evans, her expression tense but resolute. "Thank you for coming," Chief Donovan said, his voice calm but firm. "We've been following the situation closely, and we want to ensure that the investigation into Officer Barnes is conducted fairly and thoroughly." Henry gave a curt nod as they sat down. "That's what we're here to ensure as well," he replied, "but we're concerned that the investigation is being delayed." Donovan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We've had some challenges with the investigation," he admitted. "There are conflicting reports from witnesses, and Officer Barnes has been a respected member of this department for over 20 years. It's not a simple matter." Naomi clenched her fists in her lap, her heart pounding with frustration. "It shouldn't be complicated," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "There's video evidence of what happened. There are witnesses who saw everything. Why is this taking so long?" Donovan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We're following procedure," he said, the words heavy with bureaucracy. Henry's gaze sharpened. "We're not here to debate procedure, Chief. We're here to make sure justice is done, and if this investigation doesn't move forward, we'll be forced to take legal action." The threat hung in the air, and for a moment Donovan didn't respond. He shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to Officer Evans, who sat quietly beside him. After a long pause, Donovan nodded. "We'll expedite the investigation," he said finally, "and I'll make sure Officer Evans's testimony is given the weight it deserves." Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something. It was a step forward. As they left the police station, Naomi felt a surge of hope. The road ahead was still long, but they were moving in the right direction. And for the first time since the incident, she felt like justice might actually be within reach. The sun hung low in the sky as Naomi stood at the edge of Clearwater's town square, her heart thudding heavily in her chest. The protest had drawn an even larger crowd than anyone had anticipated. Hundreds of people filled the square, spilling onto the streets with their signs held high and their voices echoing in unison. "Justice for Naomi! End racial profiling now! No justice, no peace." The chants reverberated through the air, rising like a wave and washing over Naomi. She had been to protests before, small, peaceful ones with friends during her high school years, but this was different. This was personal, and this was powerful. The square had been transformed into a symbol of resistance. Large banners hung from the buildings and makeshift stages had been set up for speakers to address the crowd. There was palpable energy in the air, a sense that something monumental was happening, something bigger than any one person. Naomi's palms were sweaty as she clutched her phone, checking the time. Henry had already given his speech, a passionate plea for justice that had moved the crowd to roaring applause. He had talked about the long history of civil rights struggles, about the need for systemic change, and about his own experiences as a lawyer fighting for equality. But now it was Naomi's turn. Her stomach churned with nerves as she glanced over at Julia, who was standing beside her with a reassuring smile. Julia squeezed her hand, her presence a steadying force in the midst of the chaos. "You got this," Julia said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "You've been through worse. This is your moment." Naomi took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had been thrust into the spotlight so suddenly, and it still felt surreal. Just a few weeks ago, she had been focused on her studies, working toward her dream of becoming a lawyer. Now, she was the face of a movement. It wasn't a role she had asked for, but it was one she had accepted. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the system. "Naomi, they're ready for you," Henry said, appearing beside her. His eyes were filled with pride, but there was softness there too, an understanding of the weight she was carrying. Naomi nodded, her throat tight as she looked out over the crowd. "What if I mess up?" she asked, her voice small. Henry smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't. Just speak from your heart. That's all you need to do." Naomi swallowed hard, trying to gather her courage. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but so was determination. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. As the current speaker wrapped up, the crowd turned their attention to the stage. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, waiting, expecting. She took one last deep breath and stepped forward, climbing the few steps to the platform. The noise of the crowd quieted as she approached the microphone, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Naomi's heart raced, but she forced herself to meet the gaze of the people in front of her. These were her people, her community. They were here for her, and they were here for justice. Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "I never thought I'd be here," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I never thought I'd be standing in front of all of you, speaking out for something I never asked to be a part of. But sometimes, life doesn't give you a choice." The crowd remained silent, their attention focused entirely on her. "A few months ago, I was just a college student sitting in the park waiting for my grandfather," Naomi continued. "I had just come from an important interview, and I was feeling proud, hopeful about my future. But in an instant, that hope was taken away from me when Officer Barnes decided that I was suspicious, decided that I was guilty, because of the way I looked." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the emotion she had been holding back for so long finally spilling out. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, I was just sitting there, minding my own business. But to him, that didn't matter. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a suspect, and that's the problem." Naomi paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She could see the emotion on the faces of the people in the crowd, their expressions filled with empathy, anger, and a shared sense of injustice. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Naomi said, her voice rising. "This is about a system that allows people like him to act without consequences. It's about a system that judges people based on the color of their skin, a system that treats black and brown people as guilty until proven innocent." The crowd began to stir, their voices rising in agreement. Naomi could feel the energy building, the passion of the people surrounding her fueling her own determination. "But we're here today because we're not going to let that happen anymore," Naomi continued. "We're here because we believe in justice, we believe in accountability, and we believe that we can make this system better." Cheers erupted from the crowd, the noise so loud that it shook the ground beneath Naomi's feet. "We can't change what happened to me," Naomi said, her voice firm, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. We can demand better. We can demand justice, and we won't stop until we get it." The crowd roared, their voices echoing through the square as Naomi stepped back from the microphone. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins as the reality of what she had just done hit her. She had stood up, spoken her truth, and people had listened. As she left the stage, Henry pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice filled with pride. "You were incredible," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Naomi smiled, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I just hope it's enough," she said quietly. "It is," Henry replied firmly. "This is only the beginning." The morning after the protest, Naomi woke up to find her phone buzzing with notifications. As she scrolled through the messages, her heart raced. News outlets were picking up the story of the protest, and her speech had gone viral. There were videos, articles, and comments pouring in from people all over the country. But there was something else. A headline that made her sit up straight in bed, her stomach flipping. "Officer Barnes suspended pending investigation. Clearwater Police Department under fire." Naomi blinked, hardly able to believe what she was reading. She clicked on the article. Her eyes scanned the text as her pulse quickened. The article detailed how the public outcry and growing pressure from the protests had forced the Clearwater Police Department to take action. Barnes had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation into his conduct continued, and the department had issued a public statement acknowledging the incident. Naomi's hands shook as she read the statement. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. It was the first real acknowledgement that what had happened to her wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a violation of her rights, and now the police department had no choice but to face the consequences. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Henry. Henry, looks like they're starting to feel the pressure. We're making progress. Naomi exhaled, her heart still pounding. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was progress. For the first time since the incident, she felt a glimmer of hope. A few hours later, Naomi and Henry sat in his living room, going over the latest developments. Henry was calm, as always, but Naomi could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to fight for justice his entire life. "They're going to try to spin this," Henry said, his voice steady as he flipped through a stack of papers. "They'll make it seem like they're taking action, but we can't let them control the narrative." Naomi nodded, her mind racing. "So what do? "We keep the pressure on," Henry replied. "We make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug, and we prepare for whatever comes next." Naomi knew what that meant. There was a good chance this was going to court. The police department had been forced to act, but that didn't mean they were going to admit fault. They would fight back, and Naomi would need to be ready. As they continued to work through their plan, Naomi's phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from Officer Rebecca Evans. "Evans, I'm ready to testify whenever you need me. Just let me know when." Naomi stared at the message for a long moment, her thoughts swirling. Evans' decision to testify was a game changer, but it still felt strange to accept help from someone who had been there that day and done nothing. But Naomi knew she couldn't let her personal feelings get in the way of the larger fight. If Evans was willing to stand up and tell the truth, that was what mattered. "Evans is ready to testify," Naomi said, looking up at her grandfather. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. We're going to need her." Naomi exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. The fight wasn't over, but with each step forward, she felt a little stronger, a little more prepared for whatever came next. Weeks passed and the investigation into Officer Barnes continued. The pressure on the Clearwater Police Department only grew as more people came forward with their own stories of racial profiling and mistreatment. The case had sparked a national conversation about policing and accountability, and Naomi had found herself at the center of it all. It was overwhelming at times, the constant attention, the interviews, the endless stream of comments and opinions from strangers who thought they knew her story. But through it all, Naomi had grown stronger. She had found her voice, and she had learned that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her community, for her future, and for the countless others who had been silenced for too long. The legal process was slow, but Naomi and Henry were prepared. They had gathered witness statements, secured Officer Evans's testimony, and built a solid case. It was clear that Barnes had acted improperly and the evidence was damning, but Naomi knew that wasn't always enough. The system was designed to protect people like Barnes, and there were no guarantees. Still, Naomi refused to give up. She had come too far to back down now. One evening, as Naomi sat in her grandfather's living room, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey from that day in the park to where she was now felt like a lifetime. She had been a quiet, determined student, focused on her future and her studies. Now she was an activist, a leader in a movement she hadn't asked to be a part of, but had embraced nonetheless. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Naomi asked, looking over at Henry. They had been going over some last-minute details for the upcoming court hearing, but now the weight of it all was catching up to her. Henry smiled softly, his eyes filled with wisdom. "Of course I get tired," he said. "Anyone who fights for justice gets tired. But the fight isn't about how much energy we have. It's about what we believe in. And I believe in you, Naomi. I believe in what we're doing." Naomi swallowed hard, her heart swelling with emotion. "I don't know if I could have done this without you." Henry chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You've done more than you realize, Naomi. I may have guided you, but you're the one who's stood up and spoken out. You're the one who's made people listen." Naomi smiled, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel before. She had spent so much time focusing on the fight, on the injustice, that she hadn't taken a moment to acknowledge her own strength. She had grown, she had changed, and she was ready for whatever came next. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by supporters, protesters, and media crews. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation as Naomi, Henry, and their legal team made their way inside. Naomi's heart raced as they entered the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But as she sat down, surrounded by her grandfather and her team, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had done everything she could. She had prepared, she had fought, and now it was time to see it through. The hearing was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments. Officer Barnes's defense team tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, arguing that Barnes had been following protocol and that there was no evidence of racial bias. But Naomi's team, with the support of Officer Evans's testimony and the video evidence, made it clear that Barnes had acted improperly and that Naomi had been targeted based on her race. As the hearing came to a close, Naomi felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The decision was now in the hands of the court, and all they could do was wait. Days passed, and Naomi tried to distract herself from the tension. But finally, the decision came. Barnes was found guilty of misconduct, and while the ruling wasn't as harsh as Naomi had hoped, it was a victory nonetheless. Barnes would face consequences, and the police department would be forced to implement new training and accountability measures. As Naomi stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by her supporters and the media, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was progress, and progress was enough. Henry stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder as they looked out over the crowd. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Naomi smiled, her heart lit for the first time in what felt like months. "We did it," she replied. As the sun set over Clearwater, Naomi knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, so many battles still to fight. But now she was ready. She had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. And she wasn't afraid anymore. The weeks following the court's ruling against Officer Barnes felt like a whirlwind, but Naomi finally had the time to reflect on everything that had happened. The decision had made headlines not just in Clearwater but across the country. Barnes had been found guilty of misconduct, and while the consequences didn't seem harsh enough to many, including Naomi, it was still a significant victory. A police officer had been held accountable for racially profiling an innocent person. It was a step forward, but it was also just the beginning. Naomi knew that change didn't come from a single ruling or a single protest. Change was something that happened over time, through persistence, through the collective efforts of people who refused to accept the status quo. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she had the power to help make that change happen. As she sat on the porch of her grandfather's house one morning, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sun rise over the town, Naomi thought about all the people who had stood beside her throughout this journey. The support from her community, her friends, and her family had been overwhelming at times, but it had also been the reason she had been able to keep going. Her phone buzzed with a notification, pulling her from her thoughts. She unlocked it to see a message from Rebecca Evans. "Evans, I just wanted to thank you for letting me be a part of this. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. I'm sorry again for not stepping up sooner, but I'm proud of what we accomplished." Naomi stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Naomi, thank you for standing with us. I know it wasn't easy for you either, but you did the right thing. That's what matters." Evans had been one of the surprises of this whole ordeal. Naomi hadn't expected the officer to come forward, and even after she had, Naomi had been wary of her intentions. But over time, Naomi had come to understand that change, real change, often required people to confront their own complicity in systems of oppression. Evans had done that, and it had made a difference. After sending the message, Naomi put her phone down and took a deep breath. The sun was just beginning to cast a warm, golden light over the rooftops, and the town of Clearwater felt peaceful in the early morning quiet. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, this same town had been the site of protests, of shouting, of anger and pain. Now it felt different, quieter but also stronger, like something had shifted beneath the surface. Naomi's thoughts drifted to her future. She had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer, of following in her grandfather's footsteps, and now that dream felt more tangible than ever. But there was something else stirring inside her, something bigger than just her own aspirations. The movement she had become a part of wasn't going away, and Naomi knew that she couldn't just walk away from it either. "Morning, sweetheart." Henry's voice came from behind her, pulling her from her reverie. Naomi turned to see her grandfather standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked tired, but there was a lightness in his expression that hadn't been there in months. "Morning, Grandpa," Naomi said, smiling softly. Henry sat down beside her, taking a sip of his coffee as they both watched the town wake up. After a few moments of comfortable silence, Henry spoke again. "You've been quiet these past few days," he said, his tone gentle but curious. "What's on your mind?" Naomi sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I guess I've just been thinking about everything. What happens now, you know?" Henry nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "That's the question, isn't it? What happens after the fight?" Naomi looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "I don't know. I've been working toward becoming a lawyer for so long, but now it feels like there's more I need to do. Like this isn't just about my career anymore." Henry smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You're right. It's not just about a career. It's about finding where you can make the biggest difference. And you've already proven that you can make a difference, Naomi." Naomi nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. She had always wanted to help people, to fight for justice. But now it felt like that fight had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't just about winning a case in court. It was about changing the system, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "I just don't know if I'm ready for it," Naomi admitted, her voice quiet. Henry reached over, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No one ever feels ready for something like this, but you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to keep fighting, even when it's hard." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude for her grandfather's unwavering support. He had been her guide through this entire ordeal, and she knew she wouldn't have made it without him. "I guess I'll just have to keep moving forward," Naomi said, her voice filled with determination. Henry nodded, his smile widened. "That's all any of us can do." Over the next few months, Naomi continued to balance her studies with her newfound role as an activist. She had returned to school to finish her degree, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her path was shifting. Her experiences had changed her, and she no longer saw her future in the same light. Becoming a lawyer was still important to her, but now it was about more than just a career. It was about using her skills to fight for change on a larger scale. Naomi had started attending more community meetings, getting involved in local politics and grassroots organizing. She had learned so much from her grandfather's legal expertise, but now she was expanding her horizons, learning about policy reform, advocacy, and how to mobilize people for change. It was exhausting work, but it was also invigorating. One evening, as Naomi was heading to a town hall meeting, she ran into Officer Rebecca Evans in the parking lot. It was a brief, awkward exchange. Evans was no longer partnered with Barnes and had been reassigned to a different area, but it was clear that the officer had been keeping an eye on Naomi's progress. "You're doing good work," Evans said, her voice quiet but sincere. Naomi nodded, unsure of how to respond at first. "Thanks. I'm just trying to figure out how to make things better." Evans offered a small smile. "You're doing more than most people ever will, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry for how things went down that day. I should have stepped in." Naomi studied Evans for a moment, her emotions conflicted. She still held some resentment toward the officer for not doing more, but she also knew that Evans had taken a risk by testifying. It was complicated, and Naomi wasn't sure she'd ever fully resolve those feelings, but she appreciated the sentiment. "We all have to figure out how to do better," Naomi said finally. "But thanks, I appreciate it." Evans nodded, and with that they parted ways. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough for now. As the months passed, Naomi continued to gain recognition for her work in the community. She had become a key figure in the push for police reform in Clearwater, advocating for changes in training, accountability, and the way officers interacted with the public. Her fight wasn't just about Officer Barnes anymore. It was about creating a system where people wouldn't have to live in fear of being profiled, of being judged guilty before they had a chance to speak. One afternoon, Naomi was invited to speak at a state-level conference on criminal justice reform. She had given speeches before, at protests, community meetings, and town halls, but this felt different. The audience wasn't just made up of people who already supported the cause. It was made up of policymakers, lawyers, and even law enforcement officials. These were the people who had the power to change things, and Naomi was determined to make them listen. She stood at the podium, her hands resting on the smooth wood, and looked out at the crowd. Her heart pounded, but she had grown more comfortable with nerves. She knew that what she was about to say mattered. "I'm standing here today because I experienced something that no one should ever have to go through," Naomi began, her voice steady. "But my story isn't unique. It's just one example of a much larger problem, a problem that has existed for far too long." She paused, scanning the faces of the audience. Racial profiling isn't a mistake. It's a symptom of a system that treats some people as more dangerous, more suspicious, just because of the color of their skin. And until we acknowledge that, until we make real changes to how we police our communities, it's going to keep happening. Naomi felt a surge of energy as she continued, the words flowing from her with passion and conviction. This isn't just about accountability for individual officers. It's about accountability for the system as a whole. It's about making sure that no one, no matter where they live, no matter what they look like, has to live in fear of being treated as guilty before they've even had a chance to speak. As she spoke, Naomi could see the impact her words were having. Some of the officials in the audience were nodding in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable, but she didn't care. She was speaking her truth, and she wasn't going to hold back. "This fight isn't over," Naomi said, her voice rising, "but we've made progress, and we're not going to stop until we see real change. We deserve better. Our communities deserve better. And we're going to keep fighting until we get it." The room erupted into applause as Naomi stepped away from the podium, her heart racing. She had done it again, stood up, spoken her truth, and made people listen. The day after the conference, Naomi sat in her grandfather's living room reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had been sitting in that park, waiting for her grandfather to pick her up after an interview. So much had changed since then, both in her life and in the world around her. But one thing that hadn't changed was her drive to fight for justice. Naomi had grown in ways she hadn't expected. She had learned to use her voice to stand up for herself and others and to navigate a system that wasn't always fair. And while she knew there were still many battles ahead, she felt ready for them. Henry sat across from her, his gaze soft but filled with pride. "You've done incredible work, Naomi," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You've accomplished more in a year than most people do in a lifetime." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I had a good teacher," she replied. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "You've always had the strength, Naomi. You just needed a little push to see it." Naomi's thoughts drifted back to everything they had been through. The protests, the court hearings, the moments of doubt and fear. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when she had wanted to give up. But now, sitting here with her grandfather, she knew that every step of the journey had been worth it. "What's next for you?" Henry asked, his tone curious but knowing. Naomi took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. She still wanted to become a lawyer, to use the law as a tool for change, but she also knew that her role in the movement wasn't going to end when she passed the bar exam. There was so much work to be done, and she wanted to be a part of it. "I think I'm going to keep fighting," Naomi said finally, her voice filled with determination. "Not just in the courtroom, but out here, in the community. There's still so much to fix, and I don't want to stop until we've made real progress." Henry nodded, his smile widened. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Naomi laughed, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The fight for justice wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had found her purpose, her voice, and her strength. And with her grandfather by her side, she knew that she had everything she needed to keep moving forward. As the sun set over Clearwater, casting a warm, golden light over the town, Naomi stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the streets that had become so familiar to her over the past year. The fight wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about changing the world for everyone, and she was ready to lead that change. Years later, Naomi Harris stood in front of a crowd of young law students, her heart filled with pride and hope. She had been invited to give a guest lecture at her alma mater, the very school where she had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Now she was standing before the next generation, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned along the way. Naomi had gone on to become a civil rights attorney, working alongside her grandfather in their own small firm. Together, they had taken on cases that challenged the status quo, fighting for justice and equality in a system that was often resistant to change. It hadn't always been easy, but Naomi had never given up, and now she was seeing the fruits of that labor. As she looked out at the eager faces in the lecture hall, Naomi felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found her path, and she was determined to help others find theirs. "I'm standing here today because I refuse to be silent," Naomi said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "I refuse to let the world tell me who I was or what I could do. And I want each of you to remember that you have that same power. You have the power to fight for what's right, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, and to make a difference in this world." The students listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration and hope. Naomi could see the spark in them, the same spark that had been lit in her so many years ago when her grandfather had first told her about the power of the law. "I'm not going to tell you that it's easy," Naomi continued, but I am going to tell you that it's worth it. Every fight, every setback, every victory, it all matters. And when you look back on your life, you'll know that you did something important. You made a difference. As Naomi finished, he watching Naomi's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful narratives, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below.